Hi, this is Brit Wittman for Workspan TV, and I'm here with Doug Friske, a luminary in the area of executive compensation, and our topic for today is compensation outside of the U.S. So let's start with an easy one. Why should companies be interested in executive compensation trends outside of the U.S.?
Well, there's a number of reasons, Britt. First is, if you look at some of the regulatory things that we're seeing in the market today, like say on pay, or the, not regulatory, but the separation of chairmen and CEOs. These are kind of things that took place outside the U.S. to begin with and migrated their way in. And I would expect we'll see more of that. You look at certain industry factors like in financial services, where we have CRD4 and some of the pay implications of that. If you're a financial services firm in the U.S. and you want to continue to do business in EMEA and other countries, you're going to have to comply with these regulations. You look at pay practices. We see a lot of relative TSR discussion in the U.S. Well, go back a decade and you've seen that in the UK. And I'll talk about that in a second in terms of what the trends are there. Talent. In the old days, we used to have a lot of influx of talent into the U.S. and they wanted to stay in the U.S. They'd come to university and stay. We don't see that as much anymore. The talent is going back to their home countries, and that has implications for U.S. companies both here and abroad. So I think there are many reasons why U.S. companies need to and are paying attention to what's going on outside the U.S.
Yeah, the movement of talent, I think, is fascinating. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the U.K. and some of the things we've imported and some of the things we might yet import from our friends across the pond.
Sure. Well, we talked about relative TSR. If you go back, they adopted say on pay in the early 2000s, and as part of that, there was a movement towards relative metrics, either EPS or TSR. And I think what's interesting there is that we're seeing now somewhat of a backlash in our clients in the UK moving away from these relative metrics because they've questioned what real value are they getting from a strategic standpoint, from a motivational standpoint, an incentive standpoint. I'm not suggesting that it's being abandoned, but if you look at the prevalence statistics, specifically of relative metrics and relative TSR, they are starting to go down. Another imported practice, if you will, from the UK, you mentioned, is engagement with shareholders. Again, you go back to the whole start of say on pay, they have a very active consultation process, as they call it, with their shareholders, to the point of remuneration committee members actively engaging with shareholders. So we've had some discussion of that here in the U.S. There's, I think, been some companies that have adopted that, but to date, at least from our experience, still relatively rare. So we'll be interested to see how that develops here as compared to what they had in the UK.
Yeah, certainly the shareholder outreach is a developing area for us, but I was interested in your thoughts on potentially getting Bindingsay on pay.
I think that in the U.S., I'm still doubtful. I doubt that that'll happen. I just think because of the dynamics of our shareholder base, because of some of our just cultural and economic systems and practices in the U.S., I'd be surprised. And I think there could be a pretty strong case made for the fact that we generally have binding say on pay in many respects. It isn't literally binding, but if you look at the way that companies have responded when they've had say on pay votes while passing, not necessarily with the kind of support they would have wanted, I think we've seen the practical effects of say on pay, binding say on pay, if you will. Now, if we see some kind of problem, scandal, something else come up, I think all bets are off. And another kind of related factor you see in Switzerland, another area where they actually had the popular vote, now it's still being finalized, but controlling both retention packages as well as exit packages. So it's another area where if there's enough populist sentiment in this country, will we get to a point of actually having all of us vote on pay? I doubt it, but I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possible.
Never say never.
Right, we know that in executive pay.
Absolutely. All right, take us on a tour of the world. What are you seeing develop in specific countries?
First that has to come to mind is China. In fact, China is now one of our largest markets in terms of practitioners, revenues, consulting assignments. We had the leader of our Chinese practice here in the U.S. for the last month, and the reason being, we have so many clients that want to talk about China. So what's happening? First off, the Chinese companies don't have to worry about say on pay. They're not worried about being at the 99.9 percentile. If they want talent, they'll pay whatever it takes. They very much, at least today, believe in differentiation. So there isn't the same kind of homogeneity that we've started to see creep into our practices in the U.S. Equity is very big. The equity markets there have taken off. The IPOs are hot. And so companies are finding it challenging, U.S. companies are finding it challenging to compete with the Chinese local companies, especially in the area of equity and what they can offer. Number two, we've talked about the UK and some of the changes there with respect to the relative TSR and long-term measures. I think we'll continue to see that, more of a movement towards strategic priorities. Another interesting data point, we just completed a survey of the Euro 100, so looking at Europe's largest 100 companies, and we are now at a point where approximately half of the companies are requiring mandatory deferrals of compensation, in line with some of the financial services regulations. But it's, I think, roughly exactly 47% of companies now mandate the deferral of at least a portion of cash compensation. Another area you might say, are we going to see that in the U.S.? I don't know. I wouldn't think so. I think it kind of goes against the grain of our pay performance mentality, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, never say never again, but I tend to agree with you. I think national culture also plays a factor as well as corporate culture, and it's hard to see everything that's being adopted outside of the U.S. necessarily playing the same inside the U.S. But I think U.S. companies need to pay attention to what's going on outside. Some of your points about importing talent and importing practices, definitely worth keeping an eye out. So do you see emerging countries, do you see a bifurcation between emerging and established, or do you truly see different practices evolving in different areas?
I see different practices evolving in different areas, largely a function of their economic development. So maybe there's somewhat of the emerging and the developed, but I'm not sure it's that bifurcated or that binary, I guess I would say. I think it does kind of vary, and I think the key challenge for U.S. companies will be, first off, understanding the talent challenges that we've talked about and what they mean for them, whether they are significant hirers, whether they're looking, the kinds of people they're looking for. Two then is understanding the compensation practices locally. So it isn't enough to understand, which I think has been the path, to understand what the multinationals do. What are all of our peers doing? Again, it's particularly in Asia, but also in Eastern Europe. The tigers, the local market companies are really making a big push. And so understanding what people value. Because I think innately, local people want to work for the local companies. And so there needs to be an understanding. And then finally, a willingness of U.S. companies to customize their programs, which I know, at least historically, there's always kind of it's a yin and a yang. It's we want a global philosophy, we want a global framework, and then customize it. It's kind of the centralized, decentralized kind of thing. And But I think right now, where the world is today, companies are going to have to push for more customization and just get comfortable with that. That doesn't mean a free-for-all. I think there can still be certain general principles, parameters, whatever. But we've got to acknowledge that the world is different today.
Yeah, it's not black and white.
No.
And you like the economies of scale, and yet you like the kind of engagement you get from personalization, and there's always a balance there. And I think with the international arena aspect, it just adds layers of complexity to that kind of trade-off.
Right.
So, all right, give me some predictions for the future. What are we going to see continue to develop? What's going to change?
A couple things. First off, I would expect that we're going to see global data, disclosed data. A number of countries are putting in new regulations. Korea, Japan has. We're seeing more in China, certainly in EMEA, we've seen that. And so I envision a day when we'll be able to basically open a database and it'll be global pay data.
That would be nice.
And well, you have to be careful what you ask for, because I think any time in history that we've observed more data, people often think that controls pay. Well, in fact, it makes pay go up. I think we've learned over time. And so that'll be another, I think, finding is we'll continue to see convergence of pay levels. Obviously, the U.S. is still highest paid, and I'm not sure we're going to see that difference go away over time, but I do think over time we'll see more consistency around the world. Similarly, I think we're going to see global peer groups, kind of a whole new realm of peer groups.
Sure, once the data is available.
Once the data, we're also seeing the same thing with consistent international accounting standards. As those become more, people get more comfortable and fully adopted around the world. And then once that happens, I think we're going to be in a different realm. And people often say, well, do you see executives moving from one country to another and that impacting pay? I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I think, again, with the global economy, it's where the growth is. Follow the money, as they say.
Follow the money.
And companies or countries and then companies within those that are growing at a faster rate will have disproportionate funds to invest on their people, on businesses, and I think that's going to be the biggest driver of globalization of pay. Not so much, again, executives going forward, but just the ability to pay. So we'll check back with me in 5 or so years and we'll see what happens.
Well, there you go. This has been Brit and Doug for WorkSpan TV. Check in again with us in 5 years and see what's happening in the international arena of executive compensation.